Salams, this is People's Dispatch and you're watching the Daily Debrief coming to you from our studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Dani and we have a lot to get through on the show today, so we'll dive right into it. First up, the finance ministers and heads of central banks of the grouping known as the G20 will begin meetings on the 24th of Feb to discuss all sorts of issues and set the agenda for working groups in the organization's finance track. India has assumed the rotational presidency of the G20 this year and has been talking about bringing issues of particular concern to the global south to the forefront. The meetings take place at the Nandi Hills Resort in the southern state of Karnataka, near the city of Bengaluru, which is home, of course, to a large chunk of India's IT industry. This is the first major event of India's presidency, and we have with us senior journalist Anando Chakravarti via video conference for a bit of curtain raiser. Hi, Anand. Good to have you on Daily Debrief. We're talking today, of course, about, I think, what's likely to be the first big meeting of India's year as holding the presidency of the G20 grouping. And finance ministers and central bank governors will be getting together to set the agenda, I suppose, for what various tracks will work on for the rest of the year. But 3 sessions over 2 days, Anand, what exactly goes on at these kind of meetings? Is there room enough and time enough for meaningful conversations to take place?
You know, the last time when the heads of state had come, I think in November in Bali, it kind of was sabotaged by the G7, which is the powerful nations. The G20 is an extension of the G7. It's like an appendage, you could say, where developing countries who are growing and have some heft in global politics were added on to the G7 itself, right? The group of 7. And the objective ultimately, considering that this is actually an extension of the IMF, World Bank and these Bretton Woods institutions, objective ultimately is to bring the developing world in line with the objectives of the G7, right? So if you look at it, the G20 also has the EU and it has 19 other countries. And India has had the chair earlier when heads of states were not part of it, right? So it comes by rotation. Of course, we are making it sound like that this is a great honor. Every country has gone through it. I think only South Africa and Brazil are left who will get it in 2024 and 20. So the next 2 years, they're going to get it. It's by rotation. Now, as everyone knows that since COVID started, in fact, before that, there has been a crisis in the global economy, right? And COVID has only made it worse. And then the Russia-Ukraine war and the way in which the US has played a role in disrupting Europe's dependence on Russia, right? You know how the pipelines were sabotaged. Seymour Hersh, of course, the US has denied it, but in effect, they've also admitted that they blew up the pipelines which were getting Russian gas in. And what that has caused is massive inflation in Europe and massive inflation across the world, right? It has helped gas prices, petrol prices remain very high because you look at it, American gas companies have had record profits thanks to the Russian-Ukraine war because Europe, and Germany especially, which was dependent on Russian gas, is no longer getting it. So this is a problem which is spread across the world. So I guess that objectively, the objective here would be how to solve this crisis. What do you do? And as you know, there are some countries which are facing, like Pakistan, which are facing massive debt crisis right now. China has a problem. China is slowing down, right? And that itself is another problem that the G20 faces. And if you look at it, there's runaway inflation, there's high interest rates in Europe, nothing seems to be working. The UK is more or less a deindustrialized nation. It has nothing going for it. So this is in the space, in some ways you can say it's the last attempts by finance capital and global financial institutions represented by Western nations, right, to create a consensus, to push through certain kinds of policies. And I think that one of the things that they will once again try to do, as they did in Bali, was to try and make pass a resolution which would be against Russia in Ukraine. As you know, this is not in India's interest, and India has made it very clear that it would not want that to happen.
Move forward a bit. You mentioned debt as being one of the key issues being faced by emerging developing economies, and we've seen that. Yeah, in Pakistan, I think we were talking about Pakistan just a couple of days ago on this show, so our viewers might have a fairly decent idea of what's going on there. And debt is one of the key points on the agenda, it seems, for this meeting. Is there any real potential, though, for this grouping or any other grouping to restructure debt for that is held by low and middle income countries in any meaningful way?
So, the problem lies in this. The multilateral institutions which gave debt, right, which gave loans to various countries, which is IMF, World Bank, and some other banks, like let's say ADB and stuff, which collect money from developing countries and donor countries and distribute it, give it as a loan with conditionalities, which force certain changes. And they've done it since the 1990s repeatedly, right? The problem is that a lot of debt now is bilateral. It is debt given directly by certain countries. China, for instance, was a large part of Pakistan's debt, right? If you look at the loans given to China, the government of Pakistan, 30% is from China. And the US has a certain role, and multilateral institutions, their amount has actually reduced slightly over the years. Another problem is that a lot of the debt is now held in private hands, which means that banks, funds, they have directly bought government bonds or bonds in these countries, right? And they hold the debt, and they're not going to restructure, take what is called a haircut, right? A haircut to save these countries. Now, Pakistan had traditionally had a lot of strategic strategically was important for the USA.
Yeah.
Right? Afghanistan was right next to it. There's China up there. There's Russia. So the Soviet Union at that time. And we all know what role Pakistan played in the 1979 to 1989 Afghan war with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet armies had to withdraw. And all of US aid was actually routed through Pakistan, which is why since after that, since 1988, 89, the war ended, but from 1988, I think repeatedly World Bank and IMF have given loans to Pakistan. And Pakistan has never really returned them. So they're repeatedly taken haircut because the US was using Pakistan as a strategic entity. And what the IMF apparently wants Pakistan to do, and many other countries to do, is reduce subsidies further, raise oil prices even further, petrol prices even further, and then they'll be given these loans. So this solution is pushing all these countries deeper into crisis. What role can India play here in supporting these entities? I don't know, because we also have our own strategic reasons not to want Pakistan to either collapse or our geopolitical reasons are our own, which are not the same as that of the USA or Western countries. So therefore, what role India can play vis-a-vis countries like Pakistan or let's say Sri Lanka or many of these countries which are facing these debt crises, which are created by finance capital, right? That is difficult to say, but to expect something significant to come out of this is, I would say,
overly
unlikely, Siddhant.
All right, Anand, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks again for joining us on the show. And we'll try to catch you on the 26th once this round of meetings is done to get a sense of what went down.
Thanks a lot.
Right, next up, the United States could ban tens of thousands of migrants arriving at the US-Mexico border from claiming asylum under a proposal unveiled on Tuesday. That would be the most wide-ranging attempt by Joe Biden's administration to stop unauthorized border crossings. Under the proposed rules, the US will deny mostly asylum to migrants who show up at the US's southern border without first seeking asylum in a country that they have passed through. This mirrors, of course, an attempt by Donald Trump earlier that never took effect because it was blocked in court. The measure, while it stops short of being a total ban, will impose severe limitations on those seeking asylum of any nationality except Mexicans, who don't have to, of course, travel through a third country as they share a land border with the United States. Natalia Marquez has been covering the story and joins us now for more via video conference. Natalia, thanks for joining us early in the morning, your time. I think Biden's new asylum policy is now up for public comment, I believe, for the next 30 days or so. What is your reading of the key points of the policy, and why is it coming in for so much criticism?
Right. Well, on Tuesday, Biden announced a policy proposal that would change some of the requirements of asylum seekers when seeking asylum in the U.S. So essentially now, if if migrants want to, be accepted into asylum in the U.S., they have to apply for asylum in every single country that they pass through. Essentially, only people from Mexico don't have to apply to another country. Anyone who passes through Mexico has to apply to asylum in Mexico. Anyone who passes through Guatemala and Mexico, for example, has to apply for asylum in both countries and be denied before even applying for asylum in the US. And on top of that, when they reach the border, the US, the southern border, they have to make an appointment with an immigration official through an application, a smartphone app. So this places a lot of pretty absurd requirements on asylum seekers. The asylum systems in Mexico and Guatemala are very overloaded, and they don't have the same resources that the US has. Also, immigrant advocates say that migrants fleeing violence are often fleeing the exact same type of violence that exists in Mexico and Guatemala and other Central American countries as well, and aren't necessarily interested in seeking asylum in those countries, right, with very similar patterns of violence. Also, the smartphone app is very glitchy, reportedly, and also fills up very quickly. Like, appointment slots fill up very quickly because of the massive amount of migrants at the border trying to get these appointments, right? So migrants are having to wake up, at dawn to get appointment slots on this app if they're lucky, right? So it also is very glitchy because of the system overload. So it places all these very absurd requirements on migrants. And that's why a lot of immigrant advocates are criticizing the policy.
And from a procedural or a legal standpoint, organizations like the ACLU have come out and said that they will, take this to court as they did before when Trump announced his asylum proposals. Where is the process now, and what are the steps between it becoming formalized?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if any of these organizations have already started on the process of taking this law to the courts. So essentially, this is a transit ban, and this sort of transit ban has been attempted by Trump. So this is a Trump-era policy. That's also why a lot of people are criticizing it, because Biden is enacting essentially Trump's policy, right? When he ran on a platform of being very different from Trump. But, it was just released, just announced on Tuesday. It will, if it's not challenged in the courts, which it very well may be, as the previous transit ban was successfully challenged in the courts and didn't end up going through. If it does end up going through, it will be implemented on May 11th, which is significant because that is when a Trump-era policy, Title 42, expires. And this policy essentially enabled migrants to be expelled very quickly to Mexico. And that's part of the reason why Biden even announced this process in the first place, so that there could be something in place to limit migration after this Trump-era policy expires. The border is a very contentious issue in Congress because a lot of Republicans on the right wing are very, very critical of Biden on the border. They accuse him of being too soft on the border, too soft on quote unquote illegal immigration. Of course, this isn't true. Biden has deported over, for many, many, many people. He's definitely not shy on deportations. some figures are indicate that he has deported more people than Trump did. So this is sort of a fiction, but nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure from the right wing on Biden in terms of border policy, and a lot of pressure on many different fronts. But yeah.
Thanks very much for that update, Natalia. And of course, we'll ask you to keep tracking developments on this front as they happen.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
And finally, the city of Seattle on the western seaboard of the United States is explicitly banning discrimination on the basis of caste. This makes it the first city in the US to do so. The Seattle City Council approved an ordinance on Tuesday that amends the city's municipal code to include caste as a protected category. This is alongside other categories like race, religion, and gender. The law will now prohibit caste discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodation, and other arenas, and allows caste-oppressed people in the city to lodge complaints as well. Casteism, just for a bit of background, is in many ways typical to South Asian communities. It's a form of discrimination that stems from a rigid social hierarchy determined at birth. Those on the lowest end of this hierarchy, many of whom identify as Dalit, face regular discrimination, abuse, and often even violence because of their caste identities. Though outlawed in the constitution adopted by independent India, which was authored by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, caste discrimination remains a major issue both in India and elsewhere in South Asia, as well as in diaspora communities around the world. Pragya Singh of NewsClick is with us for more on this historic first and why many people are actually not welcoming it as much as they might. Pragya, first up, Seattle taking a step that no other city or region in the US has. What's the background on that, and how did this actually come about, and what does it protect against?
Yeah, so Siddhant, the basic reason is that since 2013, there's been an Indian American woman who's been active on the political scene in Seattle. She is also, as of her last few years, a member of the city council. And she has pushed for this essentially an ordinance which says that along with race, gender, like you put it, I mean, this caste is going to be a factor in considering whether there's been discrimination or not. So the fact that there is someone of South Asian origin, of Indian origin, who is aware of the realities of caste and decided to do something about it is why we have this proposal. But we have to also remember that there is a strong 4.2 million odd Indian origin population in the United States.
Right.
And caste is a feature of Indian society, of Hindu Indian society in particular, but also in other religions of India, you find that caste has permeated the social and cultural habits. So when Indians move overseas, wherever they go, the structure of caste does travel
with them.
Along with them, right? And there are a few people who are willing to acknowledge this, a few people who are not very happy to acknowledge it. Now, there is another context, there is a particular context to the United States where Indians might face racism, and also you're uprooted and in a completely strange environment, even if you're a second generation immigrant. So what also happens is that when you try to assimilate and you're partially successful or unsuccessful, then you tend to fall back on ideas of culture, religion, history. And
identity in that sense.
An identity where you can claim that, okay, you're not that successful in certain ways, you're not fully assimilated, but hey, you come from a grand, deep rooted civilization. So over here you have the, offshoots of the militant Hindu outfits active in India, or you have their cousins, brothers and sisters who are active there. And they tend to intervene among those Indians who might feel uprooted or rootless in America and teach them a version of Hinduism where caste is seen as something that doesn't exist anymore while it exists. So they claim that talking about caste is a bigger problem than addressing caste discrimination, and that's actually the root of the problems that you said, the opposition that you said exists to this new ordinance.
several Hindu groups in the US have made very vocal statements calling this bigotry against Hinduism and racist in its own way, this measure. How do you see that argument?
It's actually an old argument. In 2005 and 2006, we saw the California textbook controversy where certain Hindu outfits like the HSS, the Hindu American Foundation, they basically said that, you are teaching about Dalits, about the oppressed castes of India, and that is anti-Hindu. There was a talk which was to be delivered last year by a human rights activist, a Dalit activist in Google headquarters, and she was prevented from doing that, and even the employee who invited her ultimately had to resign. So that employee actually resigned because the talk on anti-discrimination with respect to caste wasn't allowed. They were doxxed by thousands or at least hundreds of Google employees who said that this would lead to deaths, like people would die if this talk on anti-discrimination with respect to caste happens. So this is a hyperbole, but it is also that the same structures of Hindu society in India have migrated to different parts of the world.
Yeah.
So everybody wants to hold on to their power and not accept that there's something wrong. Then, like I said, the overlay of racism is there. There was another controversy as well. The University of California, Irvine, we saw that the Hindu foundations, which are not so benign, which are not even seen as benign by everybody in the university system in the United States, they wanted to fund a chair which would teach Indic religion. Now, Indic, of course, means that you're teaching about those religions which have the worshippers and the holiest sites in India, which meant that you exclude, for example, Islam. And this fits in with the militant Hindu outfits proposals in India as well. But very few people in the West actually understand this. It's hard to understand a culture which is new, whose people are not necessarily fully integrated into your culture.
Right.
So it becomes hard to actually address the pressure points at which Hindus living overseas, whether in America or in the UK, are facing discrimination among each other. But the Equality Labs, which is a civil rights group, has found that there is discrimination, and they say that 1 in 4 people are caste oppressed in the United States. 1 in 3 face education discrimination. So the claims of these Hindu outfits is incorrect, and it's misleading even for the Hindus who live there. They might want a caste-free world, but that is not the reality, and you have to actively have laws and ordinances like this, which is what Shama Sawant, who proposed this ordinance,
the councilwoman.
That's right, that they will take it beyond the Seattle city limits.
All right. Thanks very much, Pragya, for actually helping us get a sense of what is an extremely complex issue in the very short amount of time we had. And with that, we also bring to a close this episode of Daily Debrief from Pragya, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. You can write in to us, of course, and follow us on all the regular social media platforms. We also invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all of the other work we do. We'll see you again tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.